one of the great writers of American literature, William Faulkner, said, "I wanted to be a poet, but I wasn't good enough, so I became a short story writer. And then as a short story writer, I really wasn't good enough at that either, so I became a novelist." Now, what does he mean by that? What he means, you know, but most people don't understand what he means by that. What he's saying is the shorter, the tighter the verse has to be, the more difficult it is. It is actually much, in fact, Mark Twain made an excellent observation once to a friend. He said, "I'm sorry this letter is 5 pages long. If I'd had more time, it would have been much shorter." It's hard to write short. It's hard to write good, tight prose. But Hemingway was one of the best of all time at doing exactly that. All right, the importance of being earnest. How many of you know the play that I'm referencing here? Okay, at least know about it. Oscar Wilde, okay. Very funny, very excellent play. I actually played Ernest once. And I used that title because first of all, the play was actually kind of important in Hemingway's own life. And secondly, it's just kind of, I don't know, there's an interesting reverse mirror image thing going on with them. Okay, what I said on the slide is I use it because the one thing you need to know about Ernest Hemingway is that Ernest Hemingway is Ernest Hemingway, or was. That's it. Ernest Hemingway was Ernest Hemingway. Of all of the writers, and they have these multiple layers of their personality, Ernest Hemingway was one of the most straightforward people. Now, that isn't to say that he was one of the most likable people, but at least he was what he was, and it was always on the line from the earliest part of his writing and his adventures overseas to the very end of his life, which we'll talk about when the time comes. All right, in The Importance of Being Earnest, Oscar Wilde uses the name as a pun, which becomes perhaps an object lesson. In the play, the lead character, Jack Worthing, who is using the identity of Ernest as an imposter, by the way, he didn't choose to do that, it was kind of put upon him, it's a whole part of the fun of the play. He's an imposter, he is not Ernest. But the word earnest doesn't mean honest. The word earnest means sincere. And in the play, in the story, the character, Ernest, really Jack Worthing, is probably the most genuinely sincere person in the entire cast. And that's what makes it so fun. He's not Ernest, but in some ways he's more earnest than anyone else in the story. And that kind of plays into that first thought I had, you know, that Hemingway is exactly who he says he is. Hemingway himself cited the play. He said he didn't like his own name because he didn't like the character. He thought that the character, Ernest, was naive and even foolish, and he didn't like that. And it was a very popular play during his day. So it'd be kind of like if your name was Roseanne, and, you know, when Roseanne was a man, and everybody goes, "Oh, Roseanne," you know, and they immediately associate with that character. It's kind of how he felt about the name Ernest. All right. He possessed an enormous talent. That's not questionable. And we may believe that he was deeply flawed in his thinking, that he was tragically, I'm going to try to kind of follow the script as close as possible to keep you guys on track, because I know you're writing down. He was deeply and tragically wrong in many or perhaps most of his beliefs. But he always was, beginning to end and always, Ernest Hemingway. All right, a very brief documentary. When I say a very brief, this guy had a very, very colorful life. We're going to hit on a few highlights, but really, when you dig into the life of Ernest Hemingway, I mean, there are whole books written just about his biography to delve into all of the details of his life. He did some fascinating things, starting at quite an early age. He never pursued education past high school. His parents were well-educated and highly respected members of their community. His father was a physician. But he didn't show any interest in academics personally. He didn't really want to study. He just wanted to go out and experience the world. He'd had some success as a writer while he was in high school. And he really kind of got this bug, I want to be a writer. And so he realized that if he was going to be a writer, he needed to get out into the world and see some things firsthand to write about. And that's what he began to do. Well, the first opportunity that presented itself to him came very early. Early in 1918, he decided World War I has already been going for a couple of years in Europe. The United States joins the war, and he says, I want to sign up. I want to go. So he goes to the Army, and they say, no, you're too nearsighted. So he goes to the Navy, and they say, no, you're too nearsighted. Goes to the Marines, same thing. He can't get anybody to enlist him. But the Red Cross puts up a recruiting bulletin that they need ambulance drivers. Now, you have to recognize that there is a certain irony to this, right? That the guy who is too blind to be cannon fodder is now going to be driving an ambulance on these wrecked streets of Italy. But I don't know. I just think that's funny. Anyway, so he goes to Kansas City, signs up to become an ambulance driver in Italy. He leaves New York, arrives in Paris just as the city was under bombardment. And from there, he goes on to the Italian front. A few photographs. I don't know how well you can see them. Life, yep, it's functioning. Okay, yeah. Life in the trenches is awful. See these guys knee-deep in mud? That was normal. That was much the way life was for the troops in the trenches. And he was, as an ambulance driver, running to the front, taking people, taking them back. By the way, he also kind of served as an ad hoc medic at times because there just weren't enough people to do the job. So he was genuinely up to his elbows in blood most of the time he was there. I have here one of the early armored vehicles, a tank. One of the early tanks. They used the term tank because the first ones were built out of actual water tanks. And they figured out how to put a track on them, and the track in those days actually went all the way around the vehicle. And it had guns on the top, but really it wasn't there as an offensive weapon. It was there to provide cover for advancing infantry because they were all stalled out in the mud doing this stuff. Now this, it's tragic that you can't see this very well, but this is showing a part of the city after a bombing raid, and the destruction is impossible to understand if you haven't seen that kind of thing personally. When you walk through that kind of rubble and you smell the smells of death, the smells of gunpowder or explosives and flames and all of that, it is a sinking and horrible thing. And this is what this young man, 17 when he first wanted to go, 18 when he got there, 18-year-old young man, this is what became a significant part of his life. And yes, it definitely impacted everything else he had to do. One interesting side note about World War I. There's a saying, they rode in on horses and flew out on airplanes. This was the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Getting off your notes here for a second, so just bear with me and think with me for a moment. World War I, what's going on? Before the war, you have the Industrial Revolution. Looms of proportions that had never been imagined before, cranking out cloth, which was one of the most important things produced in factories. You have steel mills producing steel in a way that had never been done before. Everything is suddenly gearing up, and we have this powerful engine of industry. The steam engine, internal combustion engine, all of these things were starting to make possible this sort of change in the world. Now, what's happening to the people? The people in the world are looking around at all this change, and they're seeing, I can now buy a shirt for half of what it cost me 10 years ago. The price of goods was going down because productivity was going up so much. I can now buy goods that didn't even exist 10 years ago, or 5 or 2. I now can work at a job and things are more automated and less strenuous. And everybody had this kind of sense of optimism. The world was a rapidly improving place. Science was making the world better. Science and engineering, hand in hand, making the world a better place. And everybody is kind of moving forward and saying, we are heralding in a great new era of humanity. And by the way, Does anybody know in history what happens every time there is a surge of optimism in the feats of man? There is a turning of your backs on God. Happens every time. And certainly it happened here. Humanity began to trust so much in their own power, they turned their backs on church, on the normal things that make life good, of just giving to one another. They became more isolated. They became more busy. They started to enclose themselves in their homes in ways that had never been before. Church membership goes down. Church attendance goes down. The society that seems to be improving in all these superficial ways, there is sort of an underbelly of corruption going on here. Then comes World War I. And in World War I, they see, now remember, what was the savior of mankind? The machine, the internal combustion engine, chemistry doing amazing new things. What happens in World War I? Machine guns, killing people in ways that had never been imagined, mowing them down in the field like a scythe mowing grass. The things like the airplane, which is a marvel and a wonderful thing to observe for them, at the same time was a thing of terror because it was dropping bombs on them. And some of the bombs that dropped were gas canisters. Chemistry, which was changing and improving the lives of people, was now being used to produce poison gases that were causing people to die in the most horrible and heinous ways. And so all of this forms the mind of young Ernest Hemingway. So this is where we go from this sort of hope to this sort of, well, we're going to talk about it, nihilism. Nihilism, this idea that the universe is completely chance, everything is a flip of the coin, life only exists by chance, people certainly only exist by chance, and what we do and everything that happens around us, it's all chance, it's all a flip of the coin. Well, on July 8th, on the Italian front, he was severely wounded by mortar fire, and having just returned from the canteen bringing chocolate and cigarettes for the troops in the trenches. And despite his wounds, this terrible shelling took place while he was around other troops. He starts grabbing other people. Remember, I said he had kind of served as an ad hoc medic at the same time. He was more than just an ambulance driver. He actually helped to patch people up. Probably did a lot of triage, just kind of figuring out who was worth putting your effort into saving and who you just had to say, it's too bad for him, which is a hard fact of war. So he's over there, he's dragging people out of the trenches or out of their areas, their barracks areas, and dragging them to the ambulance and helping people, even though he himself was very seriously wounded and needed to go to the hospital for surgery himself. And for this, he would receive the Italian Silver Medal, which is about the equivalent of the Silver Star in U.S. medals, if you're familiar with U.S. medals. And he was still only 18 at the time. 18-year-old kid doing all of this. And here's what he had to say about the incident. When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. Then when you are badly wounded the first time, you lose that illusion, and you know it can happen to you. Changed everything, the flip of the coin, that whole idea of chance. Why did he get hit only so bad when other people were not hit at all and some people were killed? Well, a boy trying to reason through all of that stuff had some real struggles.